The materials you'll need to make your own hand-embroidered felt patch are needles, heavy-duty felt, embroidery floss, a pattern, I chose Canary from Hunter x Hunter, and a way to transfer the pattern onto the felt. There are a few different ways to do this. I recommend using water-soluble stabilizer or water-soluble marker. Felt is quite thick and it can be really difficult or impossible to use the light pad transfer method. So what I normally do is print out or trace my design onto water-soluble stabilizer, or I'll draw the design directly onto the felt freehand with a water-soluble marker. The first step is to cut out the pattern that's been printed on water-soluble stabilizer. I like to leave a bit of an edge on the stabilizer when cutting it out. If you drew your pattern directly onto the felt, you can skip this step. Next, I remove the stabilizer from the backing and stick it to the felt. The felt is pretty sturdy, so I'm not going to need to use a hoop while embroidering, but I do cut it down to a smaller size so it'll be easier to work. I then pick out the embroidery floss I'll need. I just use a reference photo of the character I'm embroidering and try to match the colors as best as possible. These are all the colors that I picked out. Your pattern can be as simple or as complex as you like, and use as few or as many colors as you want. Next, I start to fill in the design. When I use water-soluble stabilizer, I always start by securing the stabilizer to the felt. It does stick on, but I've noticed that the stabilizer can move or warp with tension as I work, so by placing down a few stitches in the center and all around the edges of the stabilizer, I can make sure that the pattern will stay in place while I embroider. These stitches are usually pretty small and far enough from the edge to be easily removed once the embroidery is complete. Once the initial stitches are in, I begin to fill the first section. When I first started embroidering, I always began with an outline. This can help a lot if you're using water-soluble markers because they can fade and disappear over time, and it can really help to have a permanent outline of your design on the fabric or felt. However, over time I started filling in areas first and then adding in the outline because it looks a lot neater in my embroideries. I recommend trying both ways and doing what works best for you. For this embroidery, I filled in one section at a time, mostly with long and short stitches. Once I get to the end of the strand of thread, I usually make 2 to 3 tiny stitches to secure the thread to the felt. I do this in areas that will be covered, but if there are none, I will weave the excess thread through the stitches in the back of the embroidery. Another thing I like to do while filling in an area is lay down some initial stitches in the direction I would like the thread to go in. Adding in some curves in different directions to your stitches can add a lot of detail, texture, and shape to your embroidery. Sometimes I'll even draw in the direction I want the stitches to go in with water-soluble markers so I can have a bit of a guide while I work. I also added in a few satin stitches to fill in some areas. I mentioned in another video that you want to be careful with satin stitches because if you make them too long, they won't hold their shape well unless the embroidered fabric is kept taut or in a frame or hoop. However, heavy-duty felt is sturdy enough to hold its shape, so I found that you can get away with longer satin stitches when you're working with it. This is how the finished embroidery turned out. At this point, I still need to go in and remove the initial stitches I put in to secure the stabilizer to the felt. This is pretty simple and I like to use a seam ripper. I just carefully cut through the light blue anchor stitches on the front and back of the embroidery and use my fingers or tweezers to pull out the thread. Once they're out, I use a water dropper to get rid of the excess stabilizer along the edges. You can also run your embroidery underwater to do this. The adhesive can get a little messy, but it's best to be patient so you don't mess up any part of your embroidery. Once it's dry, it's time to cut out the patch. I usually leave about 1/4 of an inch around the embroidery. I go in and cut off any pointy edges because it can be really difficult to put an edge on such a sharp point. Sometimes I even go in and round them out. Because felt doesn't fray like cotton fabric, you don't actually need to add an edge to the patch. I usually don't add an edge unless I think it's necessary. I decided to add one to this patch because I wanted the embroidery to stand out more against the black background. I picked out this light blue color that I used for her tie. To start, I go in with 3 strands of embroidery floss and knot the end. I bring the needle up from the back to make a small anchor stitch. Then I start adding an edge with a simple whip stitch. With the thread coming from below, I take my needle into the felt from the top right along the border of the embroidery and pull it down through to cover the edge. I repeat this process, taking the needle down into the felt from the top and pulling it through until I completely cover the edge. I like to put the stitches as close together as I can to get as much coverage as possible, but that's just personal preference. The point of doing this is to protect the raw edges of the fabric that can easily fray over time, but since that's not really an issue with felt, the stitches can be as far or close together as you like, and it won't really affect the fraying. When I get to the end of a length of floss, I just turn over the patch and weave it under the previous stitches as far as I can go and snip off the end. This last step is completely optional, but it can help secure the threads in the back of your patch. Since there's no backing and the embroidery is exposed, I will sometimes add Mod Podge to the backs. Mod Podge is really nice because it doesn't dry super hard or brittle and it dries clear. I just carefully add it to the back of the embroidery and let it dry. At this point, the patch is complete. You can see how it looks after the Mod Podge has dried on the back. I'm going to be adding this to the same jacket that I showed in my iron-on patch tutorial, which I'll link in the video description. I think I'm going to sew it onto the front here. Here are a few other felt patches that I've made using this exact same process. Most of these are available on my Etsy shop if anyone's interested. The link is in my bio. I hope you found this tutorial useful. Make sure to leave any questions you might have down below and I will do my best to answer them.